How did people grow more food with fewer tools, no machines, and barely any free time? Medieval farmers had rough lives, but somehow their harvests kept getting better. No modern tricks, no shortcuts, just old school methods that actually worked. Their first method? Crop rotation. The smartest, do less, get more trick medieval farmers ever figured out. Kind of like finding the TV remote so you don't have to get up to change channels, except this trick actually fed entire villages. Medieval farmers split their land into 2 or 3 separate fields. In one field, they'd plant wheat or rye for bread. In another field, they'd plant beans or peas that put nutrients back into the soil. And if they had a third field, they'd leave it empty for a year, the medieval equivalent of telling a field, take a nap, you look tired. The next year, they rotated everything. Wheat field becomes bean field. Bean field becomes empty field. Empty field grows wheat. Why did this work? Different plants take different things from the soil. Wheat and rye take nitrogen out. Beans and peas put nitrogen back in. The empty fallow field recovers naturally. Medieval farmers knew that sometimes the most productive thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all. A lesson I wish my boss would learn about staff meetings. This rotation system had major benefits. The soil stayed healthy without adding much fertilizer. Crop diseases couldn't build up. It's like playing musical chairs with bugs, except when the music stops, they don't find a place to sit. They starve. Weed problems decreased. It's like making sure the neighborhood troublemaker keeps moving houses before they can establish a proper kingdom of chaos. It spread out risk. Bad weather might ruin wheat, but spare the beans. And farmers grew more food while working less. Studies show crop rotation increased yields by 20 to 30%. By the 1300s, this system was standard across Europe. In England, they called it the 3-field system. In Germany and France, the 2-field system. Leave it to medieval Europeans to argue about farming methods like we argue about which streaming service has better shows. This wasn't just clever, it was essential for survival with less backbreaking labor. But crop rotation was only the beginning. These weren't just dirt-covered peasants, they were agricultural innovators in muddy boots, and their next clever trick would change farming forever. Farming in medieval times was a backbreaking business. For centuries, farmers struggled with wooden plows that barely scratched the surface of the earth. These weak plows made about as much impact on tough European dirt as a butter knife trying to cut through a frozen steak. The old wooden plow was just a pointed stick that dragged through the soil. These primitive tools were fine for the light, sandy soils of the Mediterranean, but completely useless on the heavy, clay-rich soils of northern Europe. But around the 9th century, a revolution happened. Enter the moldboard plow, perhaps the single most important tool in medieval farming history. What made this new plow special? 3 key parts working together. The coulter, a vertical knife that sliced into the ground, the plowshare, a horizontal blade that cut under the soil, and the real game changer, the moldboard, a curved wooden board that actually flipped the soil over. For the first time, farmers could properly turn the soil, burying weeds and old plant material that would rot and feed the next crop. Unlike modern technology upgrades that require you to buy new chargers and learn new passwords, this upgrade actually made life simpler. The heavy soil of northern Europe, once a curse, became a blessing. The moldboard plow worked especially well in dense, moist soil, precisely the kind found across England, France, and Germany. The old plows often needed 6 to 8 oxen to pull them through tough soil. The new moldboard plows, just 2 to 4 animals could do the job. That's a 50% reduction in animal power. Fewer oxen meant less land devoted to growing food for animals, and more land growing food for people. Medieval farmers could finally stop being professional oxen babysitters and focus on actual farming. Studies show that moldboard plows could prepare fields in about half the time of earlier models. That's hundreds of hours of labor saved each year per farmer. The new plows weren't perfect, though. They were heavier, more complex, and required skilled blacksmiths to create. A good plow would cost several months' worth of a farmer's income. Many villages pooled their resources to buy one plow that everyone shared. This cooperation led to more organized farming communities where people had to work together. The moldboard plow spread across Europe between 900 and 1200, transforming not just farming, but entire societies. Northern European populations boomed as food production increased, all from a better way to cut through dirt. These farming improvements were impressive, but medieval farmers knew something even more important than good tools. Medieval farmers didn't operate as lone cowboys trying to grow food on their own. Their entire farming system was built around teamwork and shared resources. Most medieval villages organized their farming land in what they called the open field system. Instead of each family having one big farm with fences around it, the village farmland was divided into large open fields, and each family farmed several narrow strips of land scattered across these fields. At first glance, this seems like a terrible system. It's like if your school assigned you different desks and different classrooms for each subject, and you had to sprint around the building all day. Not exactly efficient, but this weird arrangement had some genius benefits. First, it meant every family got some good land and some not so good land. With strips spread throughout the fields, no single family got stuck with all the bad land. Second, it forced everyone to farm together on the same schedule. When your strips were surrounded by your neighbor's strips, you all had to plow, plant, and harvest at roughly the same time. Medieval peer pressure at its finest. Oh, you're not planting your barley yet? Everyone else started yesterday. Just saying. This coordination meant people could help each other during busy times, and help each other they did. Plowing and harvesting were community events. Few families owned enough oxen to pull a plow by themselves, so they pooled their animals. Records from medieval England show that in some villages, more than 75% of farmers owned only one ox or none at all. Without sharing, they couldn't have plowed at all. Tools were shared too. Why should every family own a plow when it only got used a few weeks each year? Instead, they built the best plow they could afford together and took turns using it. This teamwork extended beyond just sharing tools. Medieval farmers would help harvest each other's crops during busy times. Studies of old manor records show that during harvest weeks, farmers might spend 3 days working on their own strips and 3 days helping others. Even food itself was sometimes shared. Many villages kept a community grain store to help families that had a bad harvest. If your crops failed one year, you could borrow grain and pay it back after your next successful harvest. The shared risk and shared reward system meant medieval villages were remarkably resilient. A single-family farm might be ruined by one bad season, but a village working together could absorb the loss and keep everyone fed. It's the exact opposite of modern farming, where a single farmer might have thousands of acres all to themselves. Medieval farmers would have looked at our massive solo farms today and asked, but who helps you when your ox gets sick or your barn catches fire? All this cooperation didn't just make farming easier, it built stronger communities. Villages developed complex customs and celebrations around their farming calendar. Of course, all this teamwork wasn't just about being friendly. Medieval farmers had another clever trick up their dirty sleeves. Bugs, pests, and plant diseases have always been a farmer's nightmare. Today, we spray chemicals to keep pests away. But what did medieval farmers do without modern pesticides? They turned to nature itself for solutions, creating clever systems that kept pests under control without any complicated technology. Let's start with their secret weapon, chickens. Medieval farmers let their chickens wander freely through fields before planting and after harvest. These feathered farm assistants would eagerly gobble up insects, larvae, and weed seeds while scratching through the soil. A single chicken can eat approximately 700 insects in one day. A small flock of 10 chickens could clear more than 7,000 bugs daily. That's better pest control than a medieval exterminator with a fancy hat. Chickens weren't the only poultry partners. Ducks were deployed to handle slugs and snails, while geese were excellent at weeding, as they would eat young weeds while leaving most crop plants alone. For the rest of the growing season, medieval farmers got creative with companion planting, growing certain plants together because they benefited each other. Strong-smelling plants like garlic, onions, and leeks were planted throughout gardens and at the edges of grain fields. The sulfur compounds these plants release naturally repel many insects. Records from monastery gardens show that monks would plant rows of garlic and onions around their entire garden plots, creating a smelly force field that many pests would not cross. Flowers weren't just for looks either. Medieval farmers planted marigolds, lavender, and other flowering plants that attracted beneficial insects, the natural predators of crop-destroying pests. Ladybugs, lacewings, and predatory wasps would hunt down aphids and caterpillars that attacked the crops. It was like hiring a tiny air force that worked for free. These beneficial bugs would patrol the fields day and night without asking for a single coin in payment, just a few flowers to call home. Even the crop rotation system helped fight pests. By changing what was planted in each field every year, farmers prevented pest populations from building up. A beetle that likes to eat beans can't survive very well in a field of wheat. In vegetable gardens, medieval farmers used diverse plantings, mixing different crops together instead of growing one type in neat rows. This diversity slowed the spread of pests that targeted specific plants. For storage pests that attacked harvested grain, medieval farmers mixed their grain with ashes from hearth fires. The fine ash would get into the breathing holes of weevils and other storage pests, suffocating them without harming the grain. How effective were these natural methods? Records suggest that pest losses might have been around 15 to 20% of crops, not much worse than modern farmers experience even with chemical pesticides. These methods weren't perfect, of course. There were still pest outbreaks and crop losses, but considering medieval farmers had to figure all this out through trial and error without YouTube tutorials or bug spray, their success is actually pretty impressive. All these pest management strategies helped medieval farmers protect their precious crops, but sometimes the biggest battle wasn't against bugs. If you've ever pulled weeds from a garden, you know it ranks pretty low on the list of fun activities. For medieval farmers, weeds were a constant enemy that could choke out crops and steal nutrients from the soil. Without herbicides or fancy equipment, how did they manage to keep their fields from turning into weed jungles? They developed multiple clever strategies to reduce weeding time and save their backs from endless hours of bending and pulling. First, medieval farmers used high-density planting. Unlike modern farms where crops are often planted in widely spaced rows, medieval farmers packed their crop plants closely together. This crowded approach meant less sunlight reached the ground, which prevented many weeds from getting started. It's like trying to set up a tent at a packed music festival. If every space is already taken, you simply can't squeeze in. When medieval farmers did need to weed, they didn't wait until the weeds were tall and well established. Using short-handled hoes called hand mattocks, they would skim just below the soil surface, cutting weed seedlings before they could establish strong roots. The timing was crucial. Studies show dedicated weeding periods scheduled about 3 to 4 weeks after planting, exactly when most weed seeds would have just sprouted, but before they could set deep roots. By hitting weeds at this vulnerable stage, farmers could clear a field in about 1/3 the time it would take to remove mature weeds. For grain fields, medieval farmers developed a specialized tool called a weeding hook. This was a small, sharp blade attached to a long handle that allowed the farmer to reach between grain plants and slice off weeds without bending over. A skilled farmer using a weeding hook could clear weeds from an area about 10 times faster than by hand pulling alone. These weeding hooks were so valuable that they often appear in lists of inherited tools in medieval wills. Apparently, "Here's my favorite weed-killing stick" was considered a meaningful family heirloom. Another strategy was to time plowing carefully. After harvest, fields would be plowed immediately to bury any weed seeds that had fallen on the surface. By burying these seeds too deep to germinate, farmers prevented the next generation of weeds before they could start. Medieval farmers also used what we now call stale seedbed techniques. They would prepare a field for planting, but then wait 1 to 2 weeks for weeds to sprout, then hoe them away before planting their actual crop. For vegetable gardens, layers of straw, leaves, and even wool waste were spread between plants to block weeds from growing. When all else failed, medieval communities turned to teamwork. Village records describe weeding days, when everyone would work together to clear fields. A field that might take a single farmer a week to weed could be cleared by the village in a single day. How effective were these methods? Weed scientists who have studied traditional farming estimate that medieval weed control methods could reduce weed pressure by 60 to 70% compared to unmanaged fields. Of course, medieval farmers didn't win every battle against weeds. If time travel were possible, you could identify a medieval farmer by their remarkably strong back and calloused hands, evidence of the weeding war they fought their entire lives. While these weeding tricks helped grow more food with less labor, medieval farmers still faced an even bigger challenge. Weather has always been the great wild card of farming. Too much rain, not enough rain, Unexpected frost, summer hailstorms, any of these could destroy months of hard work in a matter of hours. In today's world, farmers have weather forecasts, irrigation systems, and crop insurance. Medieval farmers had none of these luxuries. So how did they protect their crops when Mother Nature wasn't in a good mood? Their approach wasn't to fight the weather. It was to plan around it, hedge their bets, and create farming systems that could roll with the punches. One of their most effective strategies was to plant a diverse mix of crops with different weather tolerances. Medieval farmers grew at least 5 to 7 different types of grains and vegetables each year. By spreading their bets across multiple crops, they ensured that something would always survive. Rye and barley, for example, can handle cold, wet conditions that would kill wheat. Beans and peas can survive drought better than many grains. It's like going to a party where you're not sure about the food. Bring one dish you know you like, one that everyone else will probably enjoy, and one weird experimental thing. That way, you won't go hungry no matter what happens. Medieval farmers also planted the same crop in different locations. A wheat field in a low-lying area might get flooded in a rainy year, but wheat planted on a hillside would survive. Records show that farmers would often plant the same grain in 3 or 4 different locations around the village, each with slightly different conditions. They also mastered the art of timing. They didn't plant all their crops at once. Instead, they staggered their planting over several weeks. If a late frost killed the early plantings, the later ones would survive. Studies of medieval farm records suggest that even in years with terrible weather, farmers usually harvested at least 30 to 40% of a normal crop, enough to avoid starvation if they were careful. Water management was another medieval farming trick. Farmers dug networks of ditches to drain excess water from their fields during wet periods. In areas prone to flooding, they created raised fields by piling soil into elevated growing platforms surrounded by drainage ditches. For dry periods, some clever medieval farming communities built water meadows, systems that temporarily diverted streams to flood fields in a controlled way. Medieval farmers also became experts at reading natural signs that predicted weather. They didn't have satellite images or computer models, but they did have generations of observations to draw from. They watched cloud patterns, animal behaviors, and plant signs that hinted at coming weather changes. A red sky at night might mean fair weather tomorrow, while cows lying down in the field could signal approaching rain. It wasn't the Weather Channel, but it was better than nothing. Despite all these clever strategies, medieval farmers still lost crops to weather. Historical records suggest that significant crop losses happened about once every 5 years on average. Severe famines occurred roughly once every generation due to multiple years of terrible weather in succession. The difference between survival and starvation often came down to how well the community prepared for bad times. Medieval farmers knew that sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and sometimes it rains frogs. Their next clever innovation would prove just as important as growing the food in the first place. Growing enough food was only half the challenge for medieval farmers. Just as important was making sure that food lasted until the next harvest, or even longer during bad years. Without refrigerators, freezers, or modern canning methods, how did medieval people keep their hard-earned crops from spoiling? Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and beets were stored in underground pits called clamps. These pits were dug about 2 to 3 feet deep, lined with straw for insulation, filled with vegetables, then covered with more straw and soil. Some included a small air shaft made from straw bundles to prevent mold. The ground maintained a steady temperature of about 45 degrees, not cold enough for ice cream, but perfect for root vegetables. It was basically an earth refrigerator before refrigerators were cool, or cold, whatever. Archaeological digs have uncovered hundreds of these storage pits. Properly prepared, they could keep roots edible for up to 6 months. That meant turnips harvested in October could still be good to eat in March. Grains needed to stay dry above all else. Medieval farmers built special storage buildings with raised floors that allowed air to circulate underneath. The most common was the granary, a small building raised on mushroom-shaped stone pillars that prevented rats from climbing up to reach the grain. Inside granaries, grain was often stored still on the stalk or in its husk for additional protection. Records show that grain could remain edible for 2 to 3 years when stored this way, crucial insurance against multiple bad harvests. Meat and dairy presented perhaps the biggest storage challenges. Salt was the medieval preservation superstar. drawing moisture out of food and making it impossible for most bacteria to survive. Pork, beef, and fish were rubbed with salt and packed in layers inside barrels or clay containers. Salt was so valuable for food preservation that some people were paid partly in salt, which is where we get the word salary. That's right, people were literally worth their salt. Smoking was another key method. Meat and fish would be hung in special smokehouses where a low fire created cool smoke that slowly dried the food while adding preservative compounds. The combination of salting and smoking could keep meat edible for months or even years. Studies show that some households were still eating winter-preserved meat when the next autumn slaughter began. For dairy, excess milk was turned into cheese, covered in protective wax or cloth, and stored in cool cellars to age for months. Vegetables were often preserved through fermentation, the same process that gives us sauerkraut today. Cabbage, turnips, and other vegetables were sliced thin, packed with salt in barrels, and left to ferment, providing crucial vitamins during winter months. The most remarkable aspect of these storage methods is that they required no advanced technology, just careful observation and knowledge passed down through generations. Using these techniques, a successful harvest could feed a community not just for a season, but potentially for years. All these clever farming and food storage approaches explain how medieval villages managed to survive and even thrive despite all the challenges they faced. Their methods were sustainable, efficient, and remarkably effective given the technologies available.